Senator Kennedy, if President Johnson were to feel next year that he could only win a re-election by asking you to replace Vice President Hubert Humphrey, would you accept the Democratic vice presidential nomination in 1968?
No, I would not, but I think there is no indication that he would ask me, and I think that he's made his alliance, an association with Vice President Humphrey, and I think Vice President Humphrey should continue as the nominee of the Democratic Party, and I would support President Johnson and Vice President Humphrey if they receive the nomination of the Democratic Party.
From CBS Washington, in color, Face the Nation, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview with Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, whose new book, To Seek a Newer World, has just been published. Senator Kennedy will be questioned by CBS News correspondent Roger Mudd, Tom Wicker, Washington bureau chief of the New York Times, and CBS News correspondent Martin Agronsky.
Senator Kennedy, you've repeatedly criticized the president's Vietnam War policy, and your criticism hasn't changed it. Now, many of your supporters feel very strongly that the time has come when you should place your concept of the national interest over party loyalty and seek the presidency yourself if you truly want to change our policy in Vietnam. What do you think of that reasoning?
Well, I have found it over the period of the last 18 months particularly very difficult to talk about some of these matters without getting involved in personalities. When I criticized the war in Vietnam in a major speech back in February of 1966, after the initial stories, it was placed purely, the stories that were written and the comments that were made were just on the basis of a personality struggle between President Johnson and myself. And it's been true, really, of the period of the last, as I say, 18 months or last year, that it's always been on the basis of the fact that I would like to still have President Kennedy President of the United States. I resent Lyndon Johnson as President of the United States. It's never really been analyzed on the basis of what my criticism and the source of my criticism, or the basis of my criticism. I think that having it a personality struggle rather than an issue question has been damaging to the country as a whole and damaging really to the consideration of these matters. So I think that if I decided to run, or if I ran for the President of the United States of the Democratic Party, that I would not strengthen the question of these issues or the dialogue that is taking place in connection with these issues, but in fact I would weaken it. It would immediately become a personality struggle. It would immediately become a struggle between me as an overly ambitious figure trying to take the nomination away from President Johnson, who deserves it because of the fact that he's not only president, but served the Democratic Party and the country as president for 4 or 5 years. So I don't think that really I strengthen the dialogue, strengthen the discussion of the issues, but in fact I would weaken it by declaring for the Democratic Party, the nomination of the Democratic Party.
Senator Ken, does that mean then that you think, given all the circumstances that exist today, unfortunate though some may be, given all those circumstances, that you think that the nomination and re-election of President Johnson is the best thing for the country because in all the circumstances he would be the best man?
Well, I expect that he's going to receive the nomination, and I will support him. I think that one of the great problems that we're having at the moment is the fact that we're not really having much of a dialogue about some of these matters. That's why I said a week or so ago that it's possible that if Eugene McCarthy declares and comes into and decides to enter some of these primaries, there will at least be a discussion. I think one of the problems in the country at the moment is the fact that there isn't communication between races and between various groups in the country, that there is no real dialogue about Vietnam really anymore, that we've taken to the streets, that there's violence, that there's lawlessness, that we frequently won't let those who disagree with us speak. I think that not only the Democratic Party suffers, but the whole country suffers, and our society suffers. And I think that it's possible that if Senator McCarthy decided to run, as it's been suggested, that there could be a healthy element in that, in the fact that we then get around to beginning to discuss these matters and exchanging views. I don't think, as I said earlier to Mr. Agronsky, that it's possible for me to do it. because I don't think that I would be accepted on that basis. But I think that it is possible that Senator McCarthy could. And I think that if he performs that function, and we get it out of the streets, we get it out of marching into the Pentagon, and, as we did several weeks ago, and we have a debate, that it could be healthy for the country. I think we can expect at the end of it that, looking at tradition and looking at history, that President Johnson will be nominated. But I think that to have this kind of exchange can be very healthy, and we're not getting it from the Republican Party, certainly. They haven't offered any program, either in the domestic field or in the international field or about Vietnam, that really is very helpful or very different from the Democrats. So I think that has been harmful.
Senator, are you saying that your support of President Johnson and Vice President Humphrey applies after they receive the nomination?
Well, I think it really depends on if, assuming that Senator McCarthy goes into the race, as I gather from the newspaper reports he will, I think that I would remain out of it until at the time of the nomination, purely because I think it would be hypocritical for me, on one hand, to support many of these issues and many of the questions that I've heard Senator McCarthy speak about before, to support his position and to have some opposition to the President administration, and yet support President Johnson against him. On the other hand, I couldn't support Senator McCarthy against President Johnson, because there are many of the things that President Johnson stands for in the domestic field that I also support.
Well,
so I think that I would remain out of it.
Well, your repeated support for the Johnson-Humphrey ticket, as I understood it, applied before the convention and after the convention. Now, in the last week, there's been this refinement that you really meant to apply it only after the convention.
I never said one way or the other, but I'm not going to be coy about it. I just, when I made my statement, I was the one that was being considered as the nominee. And I thought really at that time, I was not interested in running. I was not going to run, and I thought that really every position that I took, whether it be about the domestic problems, what we needed to do in the cities, the necessity of bringing the private enterprise system in, the fact that we weren't doing enough in some of these areas, or whether it was Vietnam, or whether what we were doing in the undeveloped nations of the world, everything I said in connection with any of those matters was put in the context that this was part of a campaign for myself as President of the United States. I was the only one that was being mentioned during that period of time. We weren't really talking about the issues which I thought were extremely important. So it was on that basis that I wanted to make it clear that I was not going to run for President of the United States, and that I was not a candidate.
Well, Senator, leaving hypocrisy aside, this business of dealing yourself out of the campaign until after the nomination perhaps might seem excessively timid, even self-serving for your own political future. Don't you feel that the issue of Vietnam is so important that you should participate in this debate?
Yes, I'm going to continue to. And I'm going to continue to talk, and as I've just finished a book, which was mentioned at the beginning of this program, about my feelings about Vietnam, and I'm going to continue to talk about these issues. But I'm not talking about these issues as a competitor to anybody. I'm talking about these issues as issues which I think are important to the American people. And I'd like to have them examined on that basis. I think that what we're doing at the present time in Vietnam is a mistake. I think the course that we're following is error. But I'm saying that as a United States Senator, and I want to have what I say analyzed on that basis. And that's what I tried to make clear for some period of time. I'm not doing it on the basis of trying to build up a political following so that I can grab the nomination from President Johnson.
What do you
but
think
I am going to discuss the issues. I'm going to discuss what I think should be done domestically. And I'm going to, and I think that it's within the Democratic Party that we should have dissent. I don't think that the dissent here in the United States, or those who disagree, should be confined to those who are young. I think that when we sign up for the Democratic Party, we don't say that we're never going to disagree. I think that there's much to disagree about. I mean, we've done a great deal within this country, but there's also much to disagree about. And there is much more that we can do, and there's much more that we can do, in my judgment, not only in Vietnam, but in other parts of the world that we're not doing. And I'm going to continue to talk about those
Let's
matters.
return to the war and politics in a different way. Do you think that this administration, the administration of President Johnson, can conclude a peace in Vietnam?
Yes, I think it's possible.
When? Could it be during this election year?
Well, I think it's more difficult. I think that it's possible to do. I think that indications over the period of the last few weeks are that we're just going to go in the military field, and that we're not going to go to the negotiating table. I think that under those circumstances we will continue with the military effort, and I think that that's going to get the casualties will continue to rise on both sides, in my judgment.
Using the Truman-Eisenhower analogy, if one exists, do you believe that it will take a new president to negotiate a settlement?
No, I think that President Johnson could negotiate a settlement. I think he could negotiate a settlement. I happen to disagree with the way we're going about it, but I think it could be done.
Well, Senator, on the assumption that the indications you've seen of a more military emphasis in the next few months or the next year, assuming that that is true, how do you think then that the issue of Vietnam will affect the elections next year?
Well, I think it'll be a great issue in people's minds, and a matter of terribly troubling to the American people as it is at the moment. But I think it depends somewhat on who the nominee of the Republican Party is. And even beyond that, just looking at it from a political point of view, as the war goes on, if it goes on as I anticipate it will, that people will hold the Democrats responsible for the fact that the war is continuing and that the casualties are considerable and that the cost is very great. But I go back to the fact that I don't think that the Republicans are offering any alternative. I don't think that any of the dialogue about what we should be doing in the cities, what we should be doing about our rural poverty, what we should be doing about education in this country, what we should be doing about all of these other matters, as well as Vietnam, has been contributed at all to by the Republicans or those who expect to be the nominees of the Republican Party.
Yes, well, now, to the extent that within the Democratic Party, Senator McCarthy begins to open up a real dialogue on these matters, begins to provide a real alternative, particularly in terms of policy, particularly on Vietnam. Now, isn't it true, and I just ask you this as an experienced politician, isn't it true that to the extent that he does that, the more people who believe that you are the real alternative to President Johnson are going to bring pressure upon you and increase their activities in your behalf?
Well, I don't anticipate that will occur, but I'm going to continue as I have said, and I'm not a candidate for the Democratic nomination.
Senator,
no matter what I do, I'm in difficulty.
Well, I wasn't trying to get you to
no,
say
I
that
know.
you were a candidate.
I know
I was
you
saying,
weren't.
But
isn't that you say, isn't that what is going to happen? I suppose now all kinds of things can happen. I don't know what I can do to prevent that, or what I should do that is any different other than to try to get off the earth in some way.
Oh, Senator, nobody wants you to get off the earth, obviously.
Oh, don't.
Nobody's trying to put you on a spot, really.
No.
Everyone appreciates the difficulty of your position. But again, trying to place politics aside and dealing with the issue of the national interest, if you feel so strongly about the war in Vietnam, do you really feel that President Johnson should run? Many people have indicated that the very fact of the president's policy in Vietnam has made it impossible for Hanoi to deal with him, that it might be in the interest of ending the war and eventually in the national interest for him not to be reelected.
I happen to disagree with what the position is, but once again, I don't think that there are any easy answers to this matter, and I don't know. I happen to have a different point of view, but I couldn't guarantee to you that my point of view is absolutely correct, or that I know that it has the solution. I disagree with what we're doing, but I think that President Johnson has a perfect right to present his point of view, and which is quite different to the American people, and they perhaps will support that.
Do you disagree with the current evaluation that has just been given us by General Westmoreland, the commander in South Vietnam, and by Ambassador Bunker, that the end of the war may be in view, that within 2 years we may be able to bring troops home from Vietnam?
Well, what he said, of course, was that if North Vietnam doesn't escalate, that we continue to do what we're doing, and we continue to bomb them in the north, and they don't escalate. That's one part of it. And the second, if the South Vietnamese begin to do more. Well, I think the history over the period of the last 2 years is they're going to continue to escalate. They escalate in a different way, as I point out in my book, than we escalate. They don't bomb Detroit, and they don't bomb Chicago, and they don't bomb Los Angeles. But the Russians send them more sophisticated weapons. They send more men into the South, and the casualties go up. The casualties have gone up over the period of the last 18 months steadily. So they're going to kill more Americans. I don't see how we can anticipate that they're going to stand still as we escalate on our side. The history of the war hasn't been that. The second part of his question was the South Vietnamese would do more. Well, the South Vietnamese, in fact, over the period of the last year, have done less, far less. Our casualties are greater than the casualties of the South Vietnamese now. We're carrying the burden of the fighting. We're carrying the burden of the war. I've always said, unless it's clear that it's their war and we're over there to help them, then we can't win. Now, they've had corruption. They've had the lack of land reform. They've failed to put in the democratic procedures that I think that we should have in the democratic processes. Unless they change, unless there's a drastic change, the people of South Vietnam are not going to feel the loyalty to them, to Saigon, rather than to the Viet Cong, and feel that it's worthwhile. They're making the sacrifice. They're making the effort. The South Vietnamese army is really pulled out. Why isn't, for instance, in the Battle of Dak To, why hasn't it been the South Vietnamese army that's gone up that hill? Why hasn't it been the South Vietnamese army that's been on the demilitarized zone and stayed there? Why does it always have to be Americans? I think they should do it. They should carry the burden. Now, if they're going to do more of that, and the North Vietnamese will not escalate, which I expect that they will, and the Russians can send them far more sophisticated weapons than they have already, if all of both those things come true, then I think that we will be well on our way to winning the war. But I think there has to be a complete 180-degree turn for the South Vietnamese, and there has to be a complete change of policy in North Vietnam. I haven't seen any indication of that up to the present time. But I'd like to see the South Vietnamese do more. I'd like to see them carrying this burden. I'd like to see them doing the fighting, and not just Americans, because I don't think there's any alternative to that. We're not going to win unless the South Vietnamese begin to do more and make more of an effort. And it shouldn't be just the United States and Americans doing it. That's what I resent. And as I say, I think that when we talk about that, there's nothing about this really being said within the Republican Party or what we should do within our own country. And that's why I think that people, when we talk about the violence and the people walking out and the lawlessness, there is no way for people to express their point of view. And I think that this is most unfortunate in this country. There is an unhappiness and an unease within the United States at the moment. And there has to be an outlet for it. I think that this poses a very, very important problem. And the Republican Party offers nothing. We have to do something within the Democratic Party.
Senator, what is your view of the current form of dissent in this country? Do you find it healthy in all its aspects?
No, I don't. I mean, I think some of it where it turns to violence. I think makes there's a point to the demonstration in front of the Washington Monument. People disagreeing with our position in Vietnam. There's a point that those who feel that we should do more and demonstrate as they do. But when it gets to violence, and when it gets to walking around and committing acts of terrorism, and when it goes to not permitting another person to speak, as they have not Vice President Humphrey or Secretary Rusk, I think it's a very, very bad mistake. But I just think it's a very, very bad mistake.
Senator, your remarks about the trying to get the South Vietnamese to carry a larger share of the war there. You've been associated with this war, or with the effort in Vietnam, for many years now, in 2 administrations. Just recently, there has been an emphasis within this administration on the fact that this war is being fought in the American national security interest because of a great threat from Asian communism and so forth. Now, if that is the case, it would follow that perhaps we ought to do as much as needed to be done. And would you address yourself to that? In whose interest is this war?
Well, I think first we were there. First going to your point that I've been involved in this, and as I say in my book, I have a share of responsibility, and if there are mistakes that have been made, I've been involved in those mistakes. But perhaps if you admit mistakes, you're perhaps a little wiser than you were when you were committing them. But
could you be specific about?
Well, could I just answer
on Vietnam?
I'll answer the first on Mr. Wicker's question, because I think this really is extremely important for us. First, we were making the effort there so that people had their own right to decide their own future and could select their own form of government, and it wasn't going to be imposed on them by the North Vietnamese, and we had the support of the people of South Vietnam. I think that's why we were involved in that struggle. That's certainly the way I looked at it when I was in President Kennedy's administration and when I was with President Johnson. Now we've turned, when we found that the South Vietnamese haven't given the support and are not making the effort. Now we're saying we're going to fight there so that we don't have to fight in Thailand. so that we don't have to fight on the west coast of the United States so that they won't move across the Rockies. But our whole moral position, it seems to me, changes tremendously. One, we're in there, we're helping people. We're working with them. We're fighting for their independence. Second, we're killing the enemy, and we're also killing many civilians, but we're doing it because they want it. Now we've changed and we switched. Maybe they don't want it, but we want it. So we're going in there and we're killing South Vietnamese, we're killing children, we're killing women, we're killing innocent people because we don't want to have the war fought on American soil, or because they are 12,000 miles away and they might get to be 11,000 miles away. Our whole moral position changes, it seems to me, tremendously. I mean, do we have the right here in the United States to say that we're going to kill tens of thousands, make millions of people as we have, millions of people refugees, kill women and children as we have? There's 35,000 people without limbs in South Vietnam, 150,000 civilian casualties every year. Thousands of children are killed because of our efforts. Do we have that right here in the United States to perform these acts because we want to protect ourselves so that we don't have, it's not a greater problem for us here in the United States? I very seriously question whether we have that right. And I think other people are fighting it. Other people are carrying the burden. But this is also our war. Those of us who stay here in the United States, we must feel it. When we use napalm and when a village is destroyed and civilians are killed, this is also our responsibility. This is a moral obligation and a moral responsibility for us here in the United States. And I think we've forgotten about that. And when we switched from one point of view to another, I think that we've forgotten about it. And I think that it should be discussed. And all of us should examine our own conscience of what we are doing in South Vietnam. It's not just the fact that we're killing North Vietnamese soldiers or Viet Cong. We're also responsible for tens and tens of thousands of innocent civilian casualties. And I think we're going to have a difficult time explaining it to ourselves.
You feel that our moral position, then, is not really defensible, that it can't
Well,
be...
I think it's been badly undermined. And I think that... and I think it should trouble us. I think the picture in the paper of a child drowning should trouble us more than it does. Or the picture last week of a paratrooper holding a rifle to a woman's head. It must trouble us more than it does. All acts of aggression and death and destruction occurs in war, and sometimes wars are essential, are necessary, are going to occur. But we should also consider the price that we're paying. It's not just the Americans that are being killed and the Americans that are being wounded and the price that we're paying so that we can't do the kinds of things that we should. But we have a moral position around the world. If we stand for anything that's different from the communists, we have a moral position around the world. And we can't lose that, as it appears to be, that we are doing in Vietnam. Why can't the President of the United States or the Vice President of the United States travel freely around the world anymore? It's because of Vietnam. Why can't they go through Latin America? Why can't they travel through Europe? Why can't they even travel freely through our own country? This is more than, as somebody has described and said, it's maybe there are communists involved in this. We should look at it in an objective way of what we are doing, what we are trying to do, and what this country stands for, both within internally in the United States and what we have to stand for around the rest of the globe. If this country is going to mean anything, I mean, when we say we love our country, but we love our country for what it can be and for the justice it stands for. And what we're going to mean to the next generation. It's not just the land, it's not just the mountains, it's what this country stands for. And that's what I think has been seriously undermined in Vietnam. And the effect of it has to be felt by our people.
Senator, I wish we could continue what has turned into an extremely interesting and illuminating discussion, but I regret we are out of time. Thank you very much for being here to face the nation.